In 1936, at a time when mining operations were expanding faster than human understanding of the places they penetrated, many events were recorded only in internal reports, and others were not recorded at all. What follows was not written for publication, nor for entertainment. It is a personal testimony, preserved outside official archives, kept out of circulation for decades. During that period, mines were closed, reopened, sealed, and forgotten with regularity. Men disappeared. Accidents were reduced to a single line of explanation. Routine demanded silence, and silence was maintained. What could not be explained received a functional label and was buried under new shifts and new layers of coal. I didn't believe in stories. I disregarded local legends and whispered warnings. I attributed such things to fatigue, misinterpreted fear, or the human need to give form to what one does not understand. My work had always been to deal with what could be measured, proven, and corrected. However, that summer, in an isolated mine in West Virginia, something happened that didn't fit into any known category. It wasn't a conventional meltdown. It wasn't gas. It wasn't human error. And, above all, it wasn't chaos. What happened there demonstrated intention, awareness, and choice. This account offers no answers nor seeks conclusions. It exists only as a faithful record of what was observed, and what was allowed. In the summer of 1936 I was assigned to the southern coalfields of West Virginia, to a company operation cut into a ridge above a narrow creek the locals still called a hollow, as if a small word might keep a place from becoming large in a man's mind. In the office ledgers it was only a number, a line of figures beside tonnage and payroll. On the men's tongues it carried a different name, spoken briefly, without embellishment, and I did not hear it on my first day because no one offered it freely. My instructions were routine. I was to inspect the workings after a sequence of interruptions, review the condition of timber and roof control, examine ventilation and haulage lines, and return a written report to Charleston. I had performed such duties in Pennsylvania and Kentucky, and I had been underground long enough to trust what could be tested by hand and lamp. In mines, death does not require an imagination. It requires a poor set, a bad judgment, a pocket of gas, a roof that gives way without warning. The work teaches you to respect danger without granting it ceremony. The road into the camp clung to the hillside in tight turns. The forest pressed close, heavy with heat, the leaves dulled by coal dust where the wind reached. At the last bend the camp appeared as if it had been placed there reluctantly, a row of company houses with slate roofs, a bathhouse, a lamp house, a small office with a single flagpole, and beyond them the tipple and the dark mouth of the mine under a shed of timber blackened by years of smoke and soot. A pile of scrap rails sat half sunk in the mud. A few mules stood under a lean-to, their ribs visible, their ears turning in slow, uncertain angles. The air was wrong in a way that did not immediately register as threat. It was simply still. I have known camps where the evening quiet came early because men were exhausted. This stillness belonged to the daylight as well. The usual sounds, dogs barking, children calling, a radio leaking thin music through an open window, were absent. Even the creek seemed to run without enthusiasm. When a breeze reached the camp it died quickly, as though swallowed by the hollow itself. I signed in at the office. The clerk wrote my name with a pencil worn down to a nub and stamped my paper without looking up. He was not disrespectful, he behaved as if the act of recognizing me would invite additional responsibility. The stamp landed heavily on the page, too heavy for so small a room, and the clerk slid the paper back across the desk as though he were passing something that ought not to linger in his possession. Outside, I walked the yard and performed the first of my ordinary observations. The hoist ran cleanly. The timbers in the shed were stacked in fair order. The lamp house was maintained with adequate care. The ventilation fan showed signs of recent attention, fresh grease at the bearings, bolts tightened, the belt properly seated. Yet there was a dark streaking along the fan housing that did not match coal dust or oil in pattern. It looked like something had been thrown against the metal and had dried there in irregular lines. I wrote it down as an oddity, nothing more. I took note of another absence as I made my circuit. There were no dogs. Most camps had them, half wild and hungry, loyal to any man who carried a scrap of meat. Here I saw none. I asked a boy, no more than 8 or 9, why there were no dogs. He stared at my boots and shrugged, and his answer was not the kind that satisfies a question. "Pa don't keep 'em," he said, and then he ran off as if the subject itself were dangerous. That evening the foreman met me near the bathhouse. His name was Rourke, a square-shouldered man with the posture of someone who had learned to make decisions quickly and live with them. Coal dust had settled into the lines around his eyes and remained there, giving his face a permanent shadowed expression. He shook my hand firmly and spoke with the practical courtesy miners reserve for officials who might be helpful rather than punitive. He told me, in the same tone he might have used to discuss an unsafe roof, that the lower headings had caused trouble. He did not specify what kind. When I asked whether the trouble was gas or water, he hesitated, then said it had been touchy in a way that made the word feel like a substitute. He added, after a pause, that some men refused to go back in a particular stretch. That, in itself, was not unusual. Men refuse work for many reasons. A mine is an argument between a man's need and his sense of self-preservation. I told him we would proceed in the morning in the usual fashion. I would review the lower workings first, then work upward, noting the conditions and recommending correction where necessary. Rourke agreed, but he did not look pleased. He nodded as though agreeing to a plan that existed regardless of his consent. In my rented room that night I laid out my instruments and papers. I listened to the camp settle into darkness. The quiet remained, too complete, too deliberate. Somewhere a mule stamped once, then went still. No dog bark answered. No voice carried. A man might have found the stillness restful. I found it merely strange, and I told myself that in isolated hollows the world could seem paused. Before sleep I opened my notebook and wrote the date and location carefully, as I always did, and I wrote my assignment in plain terms. I did not write anything about fear, because I had none worth naming. I wrote only that the operation appeared orderly on the surface, and that the foreman had mentioned a touchy area below. I remember thinking, with the calm confidence of experience, that whatever was troubling them would prove to be timber, gas, or water, something that could be faced with light, steel, and discipline. I closed the notebook, set the lamp out, and lay down. The last sound I heard before sleep was the creek, steady and indifferent, and I recall, only now, with the distance of years, that even the creek sounded as if it flowed past the camp rather than through it, careful not to announce itself too loudly. I met the men assigned to accompany me underground shortly after dawn. The light that morning was thin and colorless, the kind that does not quite reach the bottom of a hollow. Rourke introduced them without ceremony, as if names were secondary to the simple fact that bodies would be present. There was Ellis, a timberman whose hands were thickened by years of striking and bracing, his knuckles ridged like old wood. There was McVeigh, older than the rest, his breath already carrying a dry rasp before the shift had begun. There was a young man named Wicker, newly hired from another county, too eager in his posture and voice, the confidence of someone who had not yet learned how little confidence matters underground. And there was Juno Price, the electrician, thin and careful, his lamp and tools arranged with quiet precision. They gathered their lamps from the lamp house while the attendant checked tags and numbers. His hands shook slightly as he slid the brass discs onto their hooks. I noticed it because I am trained to notice small deviations, but I attributed it to nerves or poor sleep. He handed me my lamp quickly, as though prolonging the exchange would require explanation. At the mouth of the mine the air moved outward with a steady breath, carrying the familiar odor of damp coal and timber. Beneath it was another scent, faint, difficult to place, something warm and animal that did not belong to machinery or stone. I dismissed it as residue from the old mule workings. Smells linger in places that have been sealed and reopened. I did not mention it. We stepped inside, and the daylight folded away behind us. The first stretch of entry was ordinary in every respect. The rails were aligned properly. The roof bolts were set at reasonable intervals. The timbers showed the expected wear of pressure and time. Our lamps cast clean circles on the rib and roof, and the mine responded with the small, constant sounds of a living structure, the creak of wood settling, the drip of water finding a low place, the distant, muffled pulse of the ventilation fan. As we progressed, I asked questions in the way inspectors do, not prying, not sympathetic, simply factual. How long since the last blast? Where the last fall had occurred? Whether there had been recent gas readings of note? The men answered carefully. Too carefully, perhaps, but I assumed they wished to avoid blame. In mining, caution in speech is learned early. It was after the second junction that the character of the place began to shift in ways that resisted immediate explanation. The mine grew quieter, not merely from the absence of men but from the absence of incidental life. In some workings, rats make their presence known. In others, bats cling near air returns. Even insects sometimes find their way into warm stone. Here there was nothing. The drip of water became sporadic, as though the roof itself had grown selective. I paused and held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. I listened. The fan's hum was still present, but it felt distant, stretched thin by intervening rock. Our own breathing sounded too loud. Wicker shifted his feet, and the scrape of his boot against stone echoed farther than it should have. "Air's poor," he said, attempting casual authority. I checked the brattice cloth ahead of us. It hung limp, not moving as it should under the draw of ventilation. In one place it had been torn into long strips, the edges frayed and darkened by handling. The nails that held it were bent outward, as if something had pulled at the cloth rather than it being ripped by accident or cut away. Ellis ducked under the torn edge and glanced back at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was tension in his jaw that did not belong to routine work. "Who tore this?" I asked. No one answered immediately. Rourke finally said that it had been found that way. He did not add who had found it, or when. I knelt and examined the cloth more closely. Near one of the tears were indentations pressed into the fabric, parallel marks, too wide and too evenly spaced to be caused by a tool. They looked like the impressions left by fingers, though larger than a man's, and deeper than cloth would usually hold unless force had been applied. "This should be replaced," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Yes, sir," Rourke replied, but his voice lacked conviction. We continued on. The floor beyond the brattice bore grooves that did not match cart tracks. They were irregular, deeper in places, as if something heavy had been dragged or had paced back and forth repeatedly. Pale splinters of wood lay scattered in the grooves, fresh enough that the broken fibers still showed light color under coal dust. McVeigh's muttering became more noticeable as we walked. It was not speech, exactly, more a rhythm, like counting without numbers. Juno Price swept his lamp methodically along the roof and rib, attentive to his task. Wicker whistled once, then stopped himself when the sound seemed to carry too far. I told myself that unease is a common companion underground. Darkness alters perception. Sound behaves strangely. Men project their anxieties into places that offer no resistance. These explanations had served me well for years, and I relied on them now. We reached a point where the entry widened briefly, and there I saw the first thing that did not fit any explanation I had practiced. In the damp clay at the center of the floor was a single impression. Not the print of a boot, nor the split mark of a mule's hoof. It was long and narrow, with a defined heel and forefoot, the suggestion of toes pressed deeply into the earth. Nearby was another impression set far ahead of the first, indicating a stride longer than any man's natural step. I crouched and held my lamp close. The edges of the print were sharp, not softened by time or traffic. It was fresh. The depth of it exceeded what I would expect even from a large man in such clay. Wicker stared down at it and let out a short, uncertain laugh. "That ain't right," he said, though the words sounded more like an admission than a joke. Ellis did not laugh. He stared at the print as if committing it to memory. McVeigh crossed himself quickly, then seemed embarrassed by the gesture and lowered his hand. Rourke looked away down the entry, as if the floor itself were less troubling than what lay ahead. I searched for rational causes. A hoax, perhaps. Men carve things when bored or afraid. But carving leaves tool marks, and this showed none. It was a pressed impression, the clay compacted under weight and force. I followed the line of the prints with my lamp. They led toward a darker stretch of the mine, the area Rourke had called touchy. "We continue," I said after a moment. My voice sounded steady to my own ears, and that steadiness felt important. An inspector's confidence can sometimes become a structure men lean on. Rourke hesitated, then nodded. The others followed, because miners understand hierarchy even when hierarchy offers little comfort. As we moved on, I became aware of a subtle pressure that had nothing to do with air. It was the sensation of being observed, not in the vague way men feel watched in darkness, but with a specificity that suggested attention. I dismissed it as imagination and forced myself to focus on measurable things: roof condition, floor stability, airflow. Yet with each step deeper into that heading, the silence tightened, and the print in the clay followed us, not behind, but ahead, leading us onward as if something had already decided where we would go next. The third entry announced itself not by signage or structural change, but by absence. The rails ended sooner than expected. The floor dipped and rose in uneven stretches where maintenance had been deferred. The roof lowered gradually, forcing us to stoop, and the timbering grew heavier, more frequent, as if earlier crews had sensed instability and attempted to compensate with wood. The air here felt colder, not with the cold of water seepage, but with a dry chill that did not belong to the season or depth. The brattice that should have carried fresh air into the heading had been removed entirely. In its place hung only fragments, torn cloth nailed back in a gesture that suggested reluctance rather than repair. The fabric was stiff with grime, and where it ended the air stagnated. Our lamps burned cleanly, showing no sign of gas, yet the stillness made the flame seem more vulnerable than it should have been. As we advanced, the marks on the floor became more frequent. The impressions in the clay appeared and vanished as the ground changed to stone, but the path they traced was consistent. It did not wander. It followed the center of the entry with the certainty of something that knew the space intimately. Where the floor hardened, faint scratches appeared in the dust along the rib, shallow but deliberate, as though something had steadied itself with contact rather than necessity. Ellis slowed his pace, his eyes fixed ahead. "This is where they turned back," he said, not looking at me. The way he spoke suggested memory rather than rumor. I asked who had been working here last. Rourke answered after a pause. "A shot firer named Harlan, experienced, careful, not given to panic." According to Rourke, Harlan had returned from the heading pale and silent, had set his tools down without a word, and had left the camp before the next shift. He had not returned to retrieve his things. He had sent no explanation. "What did he say?" I asked. Ellis answered again. "Said something kept pace with him," he said. "Not close. Just there." Wicker scoffed weakly. "Sound travels funny in a mine," he said, but the words lacked energy. "Rock echoes." McVeigh shook his head. "Echo don't match your step," he said. "Echo don't wait when you stop." We reached a point where a support beam lay broken across the floor. It had not been crushed from above, the roof still held, sagging but intact. The timber itself was shattered sideways, splintered violently as if struck or wrenched. Fragments of wood were driven into the clay at angles that suggested force applied low and forward rather than downward. I knelt and examined the break. The fibers were torn, not sheared. A man with tools could not have done this cleanly, and there was no evidence of blasting. The break had occurred after the timber was set, not during installation. High on the remaining uprights, above the reach of a standing man, were scars, long, vertical grooves cut deep into the wood. They were evenly spaced. I had seen similar marks on trees in mountain regions, left by animals asserting territory, but those were made in open air, under daylight, not inside a coal mine driven through stone. Wicker stepped closer, then stopped short as if something invisible barred his path. "That ain't from work," he said quietly. "No," Ellis replied. "It ain't." The silence pressed in on us. The fan's hum was barely perceptible now, stretched thin by distance and obstruction. The drip of water had ceased entirely. It was as though the mine itself had withdrawn its small signs of life, leaving only us and the dark. I became aware, then, of a smell that I could no longer dismiss. It was stronger here, unmistakably animal, warm, faintly sour, layered beneath the mineral odors of coal and rock. It carried the suggestion of breath and hide, of something living in a place not meant to support life. Juno Price spoke for the first time in several minutes. "There weren't no men scheduled down here last night," he said. "No mules either." Rourke nodded. "That's right." I straightened and looked down the entry beyond the broken timber. The darkness there felt different, not merely unlit, but active, as though it possessed depth beyond what the lamp revealed. The floor sloped gently downward, and the walls drew closer together, funneling movement forward. "This section should be sealed," I said. "At minimum until proper ventilation is restored and these supports are replaced." Rourke's shoulders eased slightly, as if he had been waiting for permission to agree. But before he could speak, a sound reached us from ahead. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It was a controlled exhalation, drawn through a narrow passage, measured and deliberate. It carried weight. It was followed by a soft scrape, the sound of contact against stone, then another, in a rhythm that suggested movement upright rather than low to the ground. Wicker froze. His lamp jerked upward, the beam trembling across the roof. Ellis's grip tightened on his bar. McVeigh took a step backward without turning. Rourke's jaw clenched, the muscles working as though he were restraining words. I held up my hand, signaling stillness. In that moment I expected the sound to resolve into something ordinary, a falling rock, a shift of timber settling under pressure. Instead it came again, slightly closer, matched to our silence rather than breaking it. Then, at the very edge of our light, there was a vertical interruption in the darkness. Not a form I could describe with precision, not a figure revealed, but the suggestion of height where height should not have been. It leaned forward briefly, as if testing the boundary of illumination, then withdrew with a smoothness that felt intentional. No face emerged. No limbs were clearly seen. Yet the impression of posture remained, upright, balanced, aware. For the first time since entering the mine, my skepticism faltered. Not because I had seen something monstrous, but because what I had perceived behaved with a restraint and timing that did not belong to accident or fear. "We're leaving," I said. The words felt heavier than they should have, as if spoken against resistance. No one argued. We turned as a group, careful not to rush, and began our withdrawal. As we did, the sound resumed, not behind us, but alongside, moving through a parallel stretch of darkness where the mine ran close to our own path. It did not hurry. It did not retreat. It kept pace, step for measured step, as though aware of both our direction and our speed. And in that controlled movement, in that deliberate matching of distance, I understood that whatever occupied the third entry was not merely present. It was paying attention. We withdrew without haste, because haste underground is a language the mine answers with injury. Our lamp stayed forward, but the circle of light felt smaller now, its edges more uncertain. Each step carried an awareness that the darkness beyond our beams was no longer neutral. It had become selective. The sound that had begun beside us did not follow directly. It paralleled our movement through unseen passages, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, always matching our pace with unsettling precision. When we slowed to step over uneven ground, the scrape slowed. When we paused, the sound paused. It did not announce itself. It acknowledged us. Ellis spoke quietly, not turning his head. "It knows the layout," he said. I wanted to disagree, to suggest coincidence, but the mind contradicted me. The third entry was not a simple corridor. It branched, doubled back, narrowed and widened in ways learned only through repetition. Whatever moved alongside us did so without misstep, without the trial and error hesitation of something unfamiliar. At a junction where an old crosscut connected to our entry, Rourke hesitated. The safest path required a brief narrowing where the rib pressed close and the roof dipped low. It was a place men disliked even under ordinary circumstances. Rourke raised his lamp and scanned the passage. In that moment the parallel sound ceased. The silence that replaced it was complete. No scrape. No breath. Even our own footsteps seemed swallowed before they could echo. The absence felt intentional, as though something had stopped not because it could not continue, but because it had decided not to. Juno Price shifted his weight uneasily. "It's moved," he said, his voice barely above breath. "Keep together," Rourke replied. We entered the narrow stretch. Ellis went first, his shoulders nearly brushing the rib. Wicker followed, his lamp shaking despite his effort to steady it. I went next, then Rourke, with Juno and McVeigh bringing up the rear. McVeigh's breathing had grown labored, each inhale a rasp that seemed too loud for the space. As I passed through the narrowest point, I noticed fresh marks in the dust along the wall, shallow impressions at shoulder height, as though something had brushed the rib while moving upright. They were not scratches made by tools or clothing. They were too regular, too deliberate. I did not stop to examine them. I did not want to linger. Beyond the narrow stretch the entry widened slightly, opening into a small junction where an abandoned room lay to the right. The floor there was littered with broken stone and old timber, a place avoided because footing was uncertain. Rourke signaled a brief halt so the men could reposition safely. That was when the smell intensified. It was no longer faint. It filled the space with a warm, animal presence that did not belong to any creature known to work underground. It carried the unmistakable sense of breath drawn close, of something alive within arm's reach but unseen. Wicker turned his head sharply toward the abandoned room. "Did you hear?" he began, then stopped. From the darkness of the room came a soft contact sound, like something placing weight carefully on wood. Not a stumble. Not a collapse. A deliberate step. Ellis raised his bar. Juno's lamp swung toward the room, its beam cutting across broken stone and shadow. At the far edge of the light, something interrupted the darkness, not fully revealed, not fully concealed. A vertical mass stood where there had been nothing a moment before, tall enough that its upper portion dissolved into shadow above the beam's reach. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It remained just outside clarity, as if aware of exactly how much of itself the light could claim. For a fraction of a second, I saw a suggestion of structure, an upright stance, a forward-set head carried with balance rather than strain. There was a glint where eyes might have been, too high, too still, catching the lamp's reflection and releasing it. Then the beam shifted, and the shape was gone. McVeigh gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound. The darkness answered, not with violence, but with a low, controlled exhalation, close enough that I felt it more than heard it. "Don't run," I said, though my voice had lost some of its authority. "Stay together." We began to move again, more quickly now, but still without breaking into a run. The scrape returned, this time behind us, closer than before. It did not pursue recklessly. It maintained distance with intention, like a thing measuring rather than chasing. At the next uneven stretch McVeigh stumbled. Juno reached for him instinctively, steadying him with one hand while keeping his lamp forward. The beam wavered, briefly lifting from the floor and cutting a higher arc through the darkness. In that brief lift, something moved. Not a rush. Not an attack. A smooth, decisive repositioning accompanied by the faint sound of contact against timber, hide or fur brushing wood. The scrape shifted from behind to the side in an instant that suggested knowledge of every crosscut and room. "It's ahead of us now," Ellis said. The realization struck with a cold clarity. Whatever shared the mine with us did not need speed. It had patience. It understood position. It was not reacting to us, it was guiding us. And for the first time, as the mine closed in around our retreat, I understood that the danger was not that it would strike. The danger was that it was choosing when not to. The decision to continue withdrawing along the main entry rather than attempt an alternate route was mine, and I have revisited it countless times. There were side passages that might have shortened the distance to open air, but they were older, less stable, and unfamiliar to me. In ordinary circumstances I would have avoided them without hesitation. In those moments, with measured breath following us through stone, ordinary judgment felt both essential and inadequate. We kept to the main line. The rails guided our steps, and I focused on that guidance as though iron itself could impose order. Our lamps cast overlapping cones of light now, an unconscious effort to erase the margins where darkness could gather. Still, the edges remained. McVeigh's condition worsened. His breathing grew harsher, each inhale a labor, each exhale a wheeze that scraped at the air. Sweat cut pale tracks through the coal dust on his face. Juno Price stayed close to him, one hand ready to catch if his legs failed. The act was practical, human, and it narrowed our formation. That narrowing was the mistake. At a place where the floor dipped and pooled with water, McVeigh coughed violently and doubled over. His lunch pail slipped from his grasp and struck the rail with a sharp metallic crack. The sound echoed down the entry and rebounded from unseen walls, louder than anything we had made since entering the mine. The echo did not die as echoes should. It returned altered. From ahead came a low sound, not loud enough to be called a voice, not shaped enough to be language. It mirrored the echo's length and contour, as though the mine itself had learned to answer through a living throat. It was controlled, restrained, and unmistakably intentional. Ellis swore under his breath. Wicker froze, his lamp beam shaking wildly. Rourke's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I raised my hand again, though control felt symbolic now. "No noise," I said, the words sounding thin even to me. The scrape resumed, not hurried, not panicked, but closer than before. Each contact against stone registered clearly now, as if whatever moved had shortened the distance deliberately in response to the sound we had made. We moved again, helping McVeigh forward. The entry narrowed slightly, forcing us into single file for several yards. I went first, Ellis behind me, then Wicker, Rourke, Juno, and McVeigh last. Our lamps no longer overlapped evenly, creating pockets of shadow between us. Halfway through the narrow stretch, I noticed new marks on the rib at head height, fresh impressions in the dust, angled slightly forward, as though something had leaned close to watch us pass. They were too high to belong to a man walking upright without stretching. I did not speak of them. Speaking would have made them real in a way I was not ready to accept. When we emerged into a wider junction, the air seemed to compress around us. The smell intensified again, layered and warm, unmistakable now. Wicker gagged and clamped a hand over his mouth. To our right opened an abandoned room, partially collapsed, its interior a tangle of broken timber and fallen stone. It was not on our planned route, and under normal conditions we would have passed it without comment. Something inside it shifted. The sound was subtle, a careful placement of weight on wood, followed by the faintest brush of contact along the wall. Not the frantic movement of an animal startled by light. The movement of something repositioning with awareness. Juno's lamp swung instinctively toward the room. The beam caught the debris, the broken timbers, the uneven floor, and at the far edge of illumination, a vertical presence that did not belong to the mine. It stood upright, its upper portion lost in shadow above the beam's reach. No clear outline resolved. No features presented themselves fully. There was only the certainty of height, balance, and stillness. For an instant, light reflected from a surface that suggested eyes, too high, too steady, catching the beam and releasing it without flinching. Then Juno's lamp shifted as McVeigh sagged against him, and the darkness reclaimed its shape. In that same instant, the scrape sounded behind us. Not running. Not lunging. Simply moving. Rourke shouted Juno's name, the first time any of us raised our voices fully. The sound tore through the entry and died without answer. The darkness responded by changing position. I felt it rather than saw it, the way air changes when a large body occupies space nearby. The smell surged. There was a soft, heavy contact sound, like hide or fur brushing timber, close enough that it raised the hairs along my arms. Then Juno Price was no longer beside us. There was no scream. No struggle. One moment his lamp cast light across the floor, the next, the light vanished, swallowed by the abandoned room as though a hand had closed around it. McVeigh collapsed completely, his knees buckling as he cried out Juno's name. Wicker stumbled backward, nearly falling. Ellis swung his bar toward the darkness without purpose, his strike meeting only air. I shouted again, calling Juno's name, my voice cracking against the mind's silence. The abandoned room answered only with stillness. We edged closer to the threshold, our lamps probing the debris-strewn floor. Fresh marks scored the clay, long drag impressions leading inward, ending abruptly where the darkness deepened. There was no sign of a fall. No sign of collapse. Only absence. No scrape followed. No breath announced itself. Whatever had taken Juno had withdrawn, not in retreat, but in completion. In that moment I understood something with terrible clarity: it had not acted out of panic or hunger. It had acted because it had chosen a moment when we could not respond. We did not enter the abandoned room. That decision was not spoken aloud, yet it was unanimous. Every man present understood, without discussion, that crossing that threshold would not bring Juno Price back. The mine had already demonstrated the terms under which it allowed movement, and those terms did not include negotiation. Ellis stood at the edge of the room with his bar raised, his shoulders squared as if strength alone might impose limits. His hands shook despite the effort to steady them. Wicker crouched near the wall, breathing in short, shallow bursts, his eyes fixed on the darkness as though it might move again if he looked away. Rourke knelt beside McVeigh, who lay on his side clutching his chest, his cough tearing at him with renewed violence. I studied the marks at the threshold. The drag impressions were clear and direct, pressed deeply into the clay and then simply gone, as if the floor itself had surrendered what it held. There were no signs of a struggle. No scattered debris. No blood. The absence was precise, almost careful. Juno, Rourke called once more, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. The mine resumed its ordinary sounds in a way that felt obscene. Water dripped somewhere deeper in. Timber creaked faintly under pressure. The fan's distant hum returned, thin but persistent. It was as if the space had decided the event was complete and required no further acknowledgement. "We have to get out," I said. The words carried no authority now, only necessity. McVeigh won't make it much farther without air. Ellis lowered his bar slowly. "It's still here," he said. It was not a question. I did not argue. I did not need to. The certainty had settled into me with a calm that frightened me more than panic would have. Whatever shared the mine with us had not fled. It had simply withdrawn to a distance of its own choosing. We lifted McVeigh between us. He was lighter than I expected, his body weakened by years of dust and the violence of fear. Wicker took the lead now, desperate to be moving, while Ellis brought up the rear, his lamp sweeping constantly across the walls and floor behind us. For a long stretch there was no sound beyond our own effort. No scrape. No breath. That silence was worse than pursuit. It suggested watchfulness rather than absence. As we moved, I became aware of another change. The prints we had followed earlier no longer appeared ahead of us. Instead, fresh impressions emerged beside the path, then behind, as though whatever made them had altered its route. It was no longer guiding us forward. It was observing our retreat from multiple positions. At one junction, Ellis halted abruptly. "Don't move," he said. I froze. Wicker froze. Even McVeigh, half-conscious, went still. Ellis pointed his lamp at the rib. There, pressed into the dust at shoulder height, were several impressions grouped together. Not scratches. Not random marks. They were arranged as though something had rested there briefly, placing weight, adjusting balance. The spacing suggested hands, or something analogous, used for support while standing upright. "They weren't here before," Ellis said. I knew he was right. We had passed this junction on the way in. The marks were new. A sound followed, so faint it might have been mistaken for the mine settling. A slow exhalation, drawn out, controlled, coming from somewhere above the entry rather than along it. Not from the floor. Not from a room. From height. Wicker let out a sob he could not contain. Rourke whispered a prayer under his breath, words tumbling without structure. I felt then, not fear exactly, but recognition. The awareness that whatever occupied the mine was not bound to the paths we walked. It used vertical space as easily as horizontal. It did not need to reveal itself fully to assert dominance. We moved again, slower now, burdened by McVeigh's weight and our own caution. The smell returned intermittently, appearing and fading as though carried deliberately to us and then withdrawn. Each time it appeared, it felt closer than before. At one point the scrape sounded directly above us, accompanied by a faint vibration in the timbers overhead. Dust drifted down, fine and dry, sprinkling our lamps and shoulders. The roof did not crack. The supports did not fail. Whatever had caused the vibration had placed its weight carefully, testing rather than forcing. Ellis looked up, his face pale. "It's walking the roof," he said. I could not correct him. I could only register that the mine's vertical limits no longer applied. When the sound ceased again, it did so abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt attentive. The absence of noise carried meaning now. It suggested that we were being allowed to proceed, not because we were safe, but because our departure served a purpose. By the time the main entry came into sight, marked by better timber and the faint pull of moving air, my thoughts had narrowed to a single imperative: reach daylight without provoking whatever had chosen to spare us thus far. Behind us, somewhere beyond the reach of lamps and certainty, the mine held its breath. And we walked, knowing that if it resumed breathing, it would be by its own decision, not ours. The transition into the main entry should have brought relief. The air moved there with more confidence, drawn steadily toward the fan. The roof rose enough that we could straighten our backs. The rails ran true and uninterrupted, iron lines that suggested order and exit. Under any other circumstances, this stretch would have marked the end of danger. Instead, the sense of being permitted did not fade. McVeigh sagged between us, his weight increasing as his strength failed. His breath rattled in his chest, each inhale shallow and irregular. Rourke called ahead for help, his voice carrying down the entry, echoing against stone. The echo returned altered, stretched thin, as though the mine itself resisted giving it back cleanly. Ellis paused and looked behind us one last time. His lamp swept the darkness, catching nothing definite, only rib, roof, and the black beyond. Yet his posture did not relax. "It's not following," he said. Wicker shook his head violently. "That's worse," he whispered. As we moved forward, I became aware of a subtle but unmistakable change in sound. Our footsteps, which should have echoed uniformly, now returned unevenly. Some steps sounded swallowed, others repeated too clearly. It was as if parts of the entry were no longer empty in the way they should have been. At a long straight stretch, I stopped and listened. The fan's hum was present, but beneath it was another rhythm, so faint it could easily be dismissed. A controlled cadence, slower than a man's walk, timed not to our steps but to the space between them. Rourke heard it too. He did not speak, but his hand tightened on McVeigh's shoulder. Then, far ahead, near the bend that led toward the shaft, the darkness shifted. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. A vertical density appeared where the entry should have been clear. It did not block the passage entirely. It occupied only part of it, as though positioned deliberately to be noticed rather than to obstruct. Our lamps reached it imperfectly. The lower portion reflected nothing, the upper dissolved into shadow near the roof. No limbs were clearly visible. No features resolved. Yet the impression of height and balance was undeniable. It stood where a man could stand, but carried itself in a way that did not strain or sway. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It waited. Wicker stumbled back, nearly dropping his lamp. "It's cutting us off," he said, his voice breaking. "No," Ellis replied, his tone steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's showing us." The smell reached us then, carried on the moving air, warm, animal, unmistakably alive. It did not overwhelm. It lingered, just enough to confirm presence. I raised my lamp higher, not to challenge, but to see. The beam climbed the shape and lost it again, as though light itself were insufficient to claim it fully. For an instant, something caught the reflection, a brief, high-set glint that suggested eyes regarding us without haste. Then the shape shifted. Not toward us. Not away. It stepped aside. The movement was smooth, controlled, and economical. It did not hurry, nor did it hesitate. It cleared the path with the precision of something that understood exactly how much space was required. The passage ahead lay open. No sound followed. No scrape marked its withdrawal. The darkness resumed its ordinary shape, as though nothing had ever stood there at all. We did not speak. We did not thank whatever had moved. Gratitude would have implied a shared understanding we did not possess. We moved forward, faster now, burdened but unimpeded. The fan's pull grew stronger. The air tasted cleaner. The rails rang more clearly underfoot. Yet even as daylight neared, I felt no sense of escape, only the unsettling awareness that our departure had been acknowledged and permitted. At the base of the shaft, men rushed to us, drawn by Rourke's earlier call. They took McVeigh from our arms and laid him on a stretcher. Questions were asked, voices overlapping, but their words felt distant, disconnected from what had occurred underground. I turned once more toward the darkness of the entry. It offered no sign of pursuit. It did not need to. Whatever intelligence occupied that mind had not been concerned with preventing our escape. It had demonstrated something far more disturbing, that it understood restraint, position, and choice. And that, more than violence, marked it as something that did not belong to the world of men. The surface received us without ceremony. Daylight spilled across the yard in a way that felt improper, too open, too unconcerned with what had occurred beneath it. Men gathered around McVeigh as he was carried toward the bathhouse, their faces registering confusion before fear found them. Someone brought water. Someone else ran for the camp doctor. The ordinary rituals of response unfolded, and in them I felt a growing distance from everything I had known as procedure. Questions came quickly. Where was Price? What had happened? Why had we come out short a man? Rourke answered first, his words careful and incomplete. He spoke of a collapse in an abandoned room, of confusion, of darkness. His account avoided details not because he wished to deceive, but because language itself seemed unequal to the task. When he finished, several men volunteered to go back down. Their willingness came from the simple loyalty miners have for one another, a loyalty that often precedes reason. I did not forbid them. I could not. Authority above ground is different from authority below, and what had happened did not grant me the clarity required to command. I told them only to proceed carefully, to keep their lamps forward, to mark their path. I did not tell them what I believed had taken Juno Price, because belief had not yet settled into a shape I could present. A rescue party was assembled within the hour. 6 men, experienced and steady, each carrying additional lamps and rope. One of them, a foreman from another section, had not been underground with us. His face was unmarked by what we had seen, and his confidence was intact. I envied him briefly. They descended while we waited above. The yard filled with movement and murmured speculation. Someone mentioned gas. Someone else suggested a hidden void. No one said what the older men were thinking, because saying it aloud would have given it substance. The minutes stretched. The fan continued its work, indifferent. The sun climbed higher, casting hard light that flattened the camp's edges and made the mine mouth appear smaller than it was. When the rescue party returned, they did so without haste and without success. Their lamps were dusted white from rock, their faces pale beneath the grime. They carried no body. They carried no tools that had found purchase. The foreman spoke for them. He said the abandoned room was wrong in a way he could not specify. He said the air behaved strangely there, heavy and unresponsive. He said there were marks on the floor and walls that did not match any known cause. When pressed for further explanation, he shook his head and refused to elaborate. "It's not safe," he said finally. "Not now. Not ever." No one argued. The company's response followed quickly, as companies learn to do when uncertainty threatens order. Orders were given to seal the third entry. Timber was hauled. Rock dust was prepared. Brattice cloth was hung not to direct air but to block passage. Signs were posted citing unstable roof and hazardous conditions. The work was efficient, almost surgical, as though speed might prevent something from surfacing. Juno Price's name was entered into the ledger as missing, presumed dead due to accident. His wife arrived that evening, summoned by a message that did not explain enough. She was given a payment and a paper to sign. She signed because grief has its own economy, and resistance requires strength she did not have. McVeigh survived the night but did not recover. His lungs had been weakened by years underground, and what he had inhaled in fear did not leave him. He spoke little after that day. When he did, it was never of the mine. Within a week the camp resumed its rhythm. Men returned to work in other headings. Production numbers stabilized. Conversation shifted away from the third entry with deliberate effort. Yet something fundamental had altered. The mine continued to function, but it no longer felt merely dangerous. It felt inhabited. At night I remained awake in my rented room, listening. I did not expect to hear anything from underground, yet I listened all the same. The hollow outside was quiet, the forest holding its breath. More than once I found myself imagining the controlled cadence of that measured breathing, timed not to footsteps but to waiting. When I left the camp days later, my official report contained only what could be recorded: ventilation deficiencies, structural concerns, recommendations for permanent closure of the affected heading. It made no mention of impressions in clay or upright shadows or the way darkness had moved with purpose. But before I departed, I wrote another account. I wrote it slowly, carefully, in language stripped of excess. I recorded what I had seen and heard without interpretation. I did not name the thing that had occupied the mine, because names give shape, and shape implies comprehension. I folded the pages and placed them among my personal papers, where they would not be read by men who required certainty. As I drove away from the hollow, the road climbing back into open country, I glanced once in the mirror at the ridge line behind me. The mine mouth was no longer visible, hidden by timber and distance. Yet I carried with me the unsettling conviction that distance alone did not separate places. Some spaces, once entered, do not release their occupants entirely. And I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that whatever had allowed us to leave the mine had not done so because it feared us, but because it had learned enough. In the years that followed, I returned to other mines and other assignments, carrying the habits of my profession as faithfully as ever. I inspected roof bolts and timber sets. I tested airflows and marked hazards. I spoke with foremen who complained of costs and men who complained of fatigue. On the surface, nothing in my conduct betrayed what I had witnessed in that West Virginia hollow. Yet the mine had altered the way I perceived space. I became acutely aware of silence, not as an absence of sound but as a condition with intent. Where other inspectors heard nothing and felt reassured, I listened for patterns, places where sound should have existed and did not. I found myself pausing longer at junctions, studying the geometry of headings, noting how easily a presence might move without being seen. The mines had always been complex structures, but after 1936 they began to feel deliberate in ways I had not considered before. There were moments, underground in distant states, when I sensed the same subtle pressure I had felt in the third entry. Not the presence itself, but the awareness of being evaluated. Each time, I dismissed it with discipline. Each time, the feeling receded without incident. Whatever had shared the West Virginia mine did not follow me, yet the knowledge of it traveled with me all the same. I avoided speaking of Juno Price. His name appeared in records only as a casualty of an accident, and I allowed that fiction to stand. When his wife wrote once, asking whether there had been suffering, I replied with careful words that neither confirmed nor denied what I could not explain. The letter haunted me more than any sound underground. Occasionally, in remote camps, men would speak in low voices of things seen at the edges of lamplight, upright shapes in abandoned headings, breathing where no man stood, the sense of being watched without being threatened. I never encouraged these conversations. I did not contradict them either. Experience had taught me that denial and affirmation were equally dangerous. One winter, several years later, I found myself assigned again to southern West Virginia. The work lay miles from the old camp, yet the land carried the same narrow folds and shadowed hollows. As my truck climbed a ridge road at dusk, the forest closed in on both sides, and the light failed more quickly than it should have. For a moment, the memory of that mine rose unbidden, the broken timber, the impressions in clay, the deliberate step aside that had permitted our escape. I slowed the truck without meaning to, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound followed. The road continued, indifferent. I did not seek out the old camp. I did not ask whether the sealed entry remained intact or whether men still avoided that ridge. Some knowledge does not improve with verification. It deepens. At night, alone in boarding rooms or company houses, I sometimes woke with the sensation of a breath drawn nearby, not loud, not close enough to touch, but timed with my own waking, as though something had recognized the moment consciousness returned. These episodes never lasted. They left no trace beyond the certainty that awareness could exist without proximity. I aged into my profession. Younger inspectors deferred to my judgment. Foremen respected my caution. Men remarked that I was thorough, that I trusted neither luck nor rumor. None of them knew how little rumor had to do with it. What remained with me was not fear in its crude form, but restraint. The understanding that some presences do not announce themselves through violence, and that survival can be the result of being spared rather than being victorious. The mine had not taught me that danger must always be confronted. It had taught me that sometimes it must be acknowledged and left undisturbed. I kept my second account hidden, moving it with me as my assignments changed. I did not reread it often. When I did, I found that the words had not diminished with time. They retained their weight, their careful economy. They described events I could not revise or soften, only remember. As the years passed, the memory of Juno Price's disappearance did not blur. It sharpened. Not in detail, but in implication. He had not been taken in panic or rage. He had been removed with precision. And precision, I had learned, was the mark of intelligence. I retired quietly, without ceremony, my name passing from company ledgers into the ordinary obscurity reserved for men whose work leaves no monument. The mines continued without me. New inspectors took my place. Old headings were sealed, reopened, renamed, or forgotten according to the needs of production. The earth absorbed each change without comment. Years later, driven by nothing I could justify as necessity, I returned once to that region. Not to the camp itself, which had long since been dismantled, but to the road above the hollow. Trees had reclaimed much of what industry had stripped away. Brush covered the slopes. A rusted warning sign leaned at an angle near a fenced-off cut in the hillside, its lettering faded to the point of irrelevance. I stood there only briefly. There was no impulse to go closer. The place no longer required proof of its reality. It existed complete in memory, sealed as thoroughly as the third entry had been sealed with timber and dust. The forest was quiet, but it was not the harmless quiet of abandonment. It was the same restrained stillness I remembered from 1936, a stillness that felt aware of itself. Wind passed over the ridge and failed to reach the hollow. Birds called from higher ground and did not descend. I understood then that what had occurred underground was not bound to that mine alone. The mine had been a corridor, not a source. It had offered darkness, structure, and patience, conditions rather than origins. Whatever intelligence had occupied that space had not been created by it, nor confined to it. I have been careful, throughout my life, not to dress the memory in myth. I have never spoken of curses or legends. I have never assigned the thing a name that might suggest comprehension or mastery. Names belong to men, and what I encountered did not require one. What remains certain is this: it recognized us. Not as prey driven by instinct, but as intruders measured against tolerance. It demonstrated awareness, restraint, and choice. It revealed itself only to the degree necessary, withdrew when it had accomplished its purpose, and left no trace that could be pursued without consequence. Juno Price was not lost to collapse, nor to chance. He was removed with deliberation, at a moment calculated to leave the rest of us intact but changed. The mine did not claim him. The darkness did not swallow him blindly. Something else decided he would not return. I have carried that knowledge without display, without confession, because it does not ask to be shared. It asks only to be remembered accurately. There are places beneath the earth, and perhaps above it, where intelligence does not announce itself through dominance or destruction, but through permission. We were allowed to leave. And that allowance, more than anything taken from us, is what has stayed with me all these years. I did not submit this account with any expectation that it would be read, much less believed. It was written in the margins of my life, between assignments, between nights of uneasy sleep, preserved only because destroying it felt like an admission that memory itself could be erased as easily as a sealed entry. I have kept it as one keeps a record of debt, not to be displayed, but to be acknowledged. Time has done what it always does. It has softened faces, blurred dates, and reduced entire operations to footnotes. Yet it has not altered the central fact of that summer. What followed us underground was not chaos, nor hunger, nor some blind force born of darkness. It behaved with restraint that bordered on courtesy, with patience that implied understanding, and with intelligence that never once required violence to assert itself. I have replayed the moments endlessly, searching for some error of perception that would return the world to its former simplicity. I have found none. The mine was mapped. The men were competent. The conditions, while imperfect, were not extraordinary enough to account for what occurred. What remains cannot be dismissed without also dismissing the discipline that governed my entire career. I am left, therefore, with a single conclusion: stripped of comfort and ornament, there are intelligences that do not belong to us, that do not seek recognition, and that do not need to explain themselves. They occupy spaces we mistake for empty, and they tolerate our presence only until tolerance is no longer useful. Juno Price did not vanish into darkness by chance. He was taken because a decision was made. and the rest of us were permitted to leave because that same decision allowed it.